Welcome to the 8th video in this orchestration series. In the last video, we covered a handful of common playing techniques available to you when orchestrating for brass, including different types of mutes and glissandi. In this video, we're going to finally wrap up our discussions on the brass section by covering some specific strategies and techniques for orchestrating your music. We'll start by covering the basics of writing for brass, then we'll discuss some additional techniques for working with harmonies. Finally, we'll wrap things up by discussing a few additional things that should be kept in mind whenever orchestrating with the brass instruments. So with that, let's get started. The first thing to keep in mind when writing for the brass section is that it is typically approached as not so much one large section as three smaller subsections. The first subsection contains the trumpets and the trombones. The second subsection contains the horns, and the third subsection contains the tuba. Each subsection tends to be assigned a different role at any given point in the piece of music. 9 times out of 10, the tuba will focus on the foundational harmonies. Just like the double bass, its primary role is to anchor your music in place with a nice, strong bass line. The other two subsections are most frequently found working in separate roles. For example, if the trumpets and trombones are performing the melody together, then the horns will be performing anything other than the melody, typically harmony or countermelody. Likewise, if the horns are performing a countermelody, the trumpets and trombones can typically be found performing any role other than the countermelody. The idea behind this is twofold. One, each subsection has its own unique tone color. Trumpets and trombones are both very bright and clear, horns are more mellow, and the tuba is very powerful but thick. Two, brass instruments are very powerful. By placing each subsection in a different role in your music, you can help make sure that your orchestration is well balanced, and that, for example, let's say your harmony doesn't vastly overpower your melody. However, as usual, these guidelines are not hard rules. They make for a useful starting point, but you can always feel free to shake things up if you feel it would serve your music better. Next, let's get a little more specific and take a look at writing harmonies for the brass section. In one of the very first videos in this series, we discussed the impact that the overtone series has on proper chord voicings. Our default model was that low pitches are given open voicings and higher pitches are given closed voicings. This model has a particularly powerful impact on the brass section. Since there are relatively few brass instruments in an orchestra, it doesn't take much to impact the quality of sound being produced. If you're going for the trademark power and punch that the brass instruments are known for, you want to be particularly careful to keep closed voicings in your upper voices, whenever possible. If you're going for more of a spread out sound, sort of like an ambiance instead of a power kind of situation, then you want to focus on open voicings in your upper register. One common example of this is with fanfares. Fanfares are all about commanding a presence, and as such, brass instruments are typically found written in perfect fourths, perfect fifths, or octaves in these types of situations. Regardless of what approach you take, open or closed voicings, you're likely to frequently rely on the brass section to fulfill harmonic roles in your music. Perhaps the most common way to use the brass instruments harmonically is to have the tubas provide the harmonic foundation, and the trombones provide the harmonic bed, or the chords. In this situation, the tuba is performing the bass line, while each trombone player performs a different note of each chord in the chord progression. If the trombones are busy elsewhere, then the horns can just as easily take their place. Trumpets can work too, but since they have a higher register, you run the risk of them competing with the melody, if you're not careful with your differentiation. This configuration is very simple, but incredibly effective, especially when there are lots of things in the music that could potentially cover up or overpower the harmony. For example, with climactic strings performing the melody in octaves. Very few instruments can compete with the power of 50 or more stringed instruments all performing the same melodic line across multiple octaves. However, a few trombones and a tuba are more than capable of holding their own in this type of situation. Another common harmonic role in the brass family is to use the trumpets to emphasize important rhythmic figures in action music. In these instances, each trumpet player performs a separate note of the underlying chord or chords, and are used strategically to accent important moments or rhythmical figures in the music. In both of these situations, introducing the brass section is typically used as a strategy for growth. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, let's say that you start your piece with a solo instrument performing the melody, and the string section performing the harmonic rolls. This is a very simple and intimate arrangement. The melody is played once, then is repeated with the first violins now doubling the melody, maybe with the harp adding some color to the harmony. Notice how the overall presentation of the piece seems to have just gotten bigger. There's more of a presence to it. Then the melody is repeated a third time, but now the brass section enters. The strings are free to perform the melody climactically in octaves because the trombones and tuba are performing the harmonic foundation and bed, while the horns provide a counter melody and the trumpets provide a few accents here and there. In this case, the brass instruments were introduced specifically with growth in mind. We wanted to create a big and climactic sound, and introducing the brass at this point helped us achieve just that. If we had used the brass section right from the beginning, the impact would not have been the same. Instead, we allowed their absence from the introduction and initial repetition to highlight the drama of when they finally enter the scene. Now, this approach will all depend on what you need in your own music, but the general idea here is that brass instruments have a lot of power at their disposal, and you can use this to your advantage if you're a little strategic. In fact, there are a number of different strategies that you can use to help make the climaxes of your music all the more impressive. To just name a few good ones, use a key change when arriving at your climactic moment. Change the registers of your melody. For example, if your melody was in a lower register, raise it an octave or more. If it was in a higher register, lower it by an octave or more, making sure to pay attention to differentiation along the way. And of course, make sure to keep the brass from being used for a decently long amount of time before having them come in all together with the climactic moment. These 3 guidelines can help make your music all the more dramatic and epic when used correctly. Before moving on to our last item in this video, I just want to take a quick look at how the brass instruments were used in this particular example. If you look, you'll notice that each of the instruments kept to their subsections. The tuba is in the bass line. The horns are performing a counter melody, and both the trumpets and trombones are on harmony. The only big difference here is that the trumpets and trombones have different parts, but their fundamental roles are the same. This is very important to note since the trumpets and trombones make up the only subsection that contains more than one instrument. It isn't all that uncommon for them to split up to fulfill different jobs so long as their overall role, for example melody or harmony, remains the same. So finally, the last thing that I'd like to address is the matter of dynamic differences between 2 of the subsections. For the most part, each brass instrument is capable of holding its own against the others. However, things start to change once we start working with the louder dynamics, typically anything forte or louder. It's at this point that it takes 2 horns to match the sound produced by any one trumpet or one trombone. Of course, this is just a general rule. Things like register and range are going to have their impact, but most of the time, if you're having one trumpet and one horn play the same part, you're going to end up with a very trumpet-heavy sound, rather than a more blended sound if you were to add another horn. Now, I'm sure that some people will argue that this isn't true, and I guess it doesn't really have to be. If you're given enough rehearsal time, then you can definitely work with the players to find the right mix. However, rehearsal time is very expensive, and whatever you come up with will be less efficient than simply adding another player, and here's why. In order for each instrument to blend well in this scenario, you are left with 2 options. 1, the trumpet player must perform quieter than it normally would at the given dynamic. Or 2, the horn player must play louder than they normally would at the given dynamic. Neither is particularly desirable, for a whole host of reasons. The primary ones being tone color and energy expenditure. As we've discussed, brass instruments have different tone colors at different dynamics. If the trumpet has to play mezzo forte, or only kind of loud, in order to blend with the horn, then it won't have the same punch that you would want from performing a louder dynamic. If the horn has to perform louder to match the trumpet, its tone color will become harsher and brighter than what you may have been counting on. Not to mention it will require more effort from your player and may needlessly tire them out, depending on their skill level and how long they need to perform like that. So at the end of the day, the decision comes down to what you're looking for in your own music. However, typical best practices in orchestration would say to just double up on horn players in these types of situations. So, just to summarize, the brass section actually consists of 3 subsections. Trumpet and trombone make up one section on their own, the horns create the second, and the tuba commands the third. 9 times out of 10, the tuba will perform the bass line, while the horns can perform any role in your music that the trumpet and trombone are not. When working with harmonies, the most common role is for the tuba to play the bass line and the trombones or horns to perform the chords. Another common role is to have the trumpets accent important rhythmic figures and moments by performing them in chordal voicings. Since there are relatively few instruments in the brass section, selecting either open voicings or closed voicings in the upper registers has a large impact on the type of sound produced. In general, closed voicings pack more power and punch, while open voices create more of an ambiance. Brass instruments are often used for growth in music and can be used to great effect for climactic moments in your music. So can key changes and register changes. And finally, when working with loud dynamics, you want to use 2 horns for every 1 trumpet or trombone when you're looking for an evenly blended sound. And with that, we've reached the end of another video and another section of the orchestra. Next week, we're going to start looking at the woodwind section. I hope you found this video helpful, and if you did, please like and subscribe to my channel, and please share it with anyone else that you think would enjoy it. I appreciate the incredible support and feedback I have been receiving from this community, and I'm really excited to see what we can do with this channel. In the meantime, just keep working hard, keep studying, and as usual, keep writing new music.